So the default frame for sustainability, for solving environmental problems, is always related to individuals. It always falls on the individual. Recycle, use less, reuse, reduce, get rid of your lawn, take shorter showers. And that's great. Individual actions do matter, but this glosses over the larger proportion of the problem. The focus on the individual is disproportionate. They are disproportionately emphasized when the majority of the problem are these larger organizational and structural barriers to sustainability. By organizational and structural, I mean the way the system's set up through economic policy. For example, the fact that 80% of water in California goes to agriculture. Most of that water is also subsidized, meaning farmers don't actually pay for it, tax dollars pay for it. This incentivizes use and even waste. And so these larger organizational issues, the argument goes, need to be addressed if we actually want to solve environmental problems. This brings us right into industrial food production. Individuals can try to be as green as they want. It won't solve our problems if we don't address the majority of the problem, these structural barriers. Don't forget, also much of what we talk about today in wrapping up industrial food is also covered in the Poland readings and Bodley. And so in the US, we have a tendency to reduce food down to the parts, the protein, the fat, the carbs. What are we eating? And what are your choices? Are they your choices? In what way are they shaped or limited? Do we eat a variety of different foods? Poland, remember, calls us corn koalas because koala bears eat one thing, eucalyptus leaves. He says humans are essentially the same. We eat one thing, corn, even if it is disguised as a myriad of different products on the shelves. It's really a handful of ingredients controlled by a handful of companies that go into the 40,000 products in the grocery store. So if you want to understand what you're eating, we need to think beyond the plate, beyond the nutrient facts and label, and actually analyze the food system. Get away from the nutrient list. If you want to know what you're eating, look at the food system. So just a couple of quick examples, food for thought. First, did you ever wonder why in the US we put our eggs in the refrigerator? I didn't know that in other countries, people don't do this. I was in New Zealand several years ago and the eggs were sitting out and I asked, why? What do you mean, why aren't they in the refrigerator? They never have been. We just leave them on the shelf. So finally one day I looked into it back here in the US, and the US, in contrast to other countries, puts their eggs in the refrigerator because of the way we produce them. So remember from the film, Food Inc., we raise chickens in these crowded conditions where they are raised quickly on corn and antibiotics. Because they're sitting in their own feces, we feed them antibiotics to keep bacterial infections in check. The result, again, from that is we often get super bacterial strains of E. coli that cause other problems. And so the FDA in the US requires farmers or food producers to bathe the eggs in either chlorine or bleach. Sorry, I always forget which. You can look it up. FDA requires us to bathe eggs in chemicals in order to kill any bacteria that might be sitting on the outside of the shell. Because they're bathed in these chemicals, it weakens the shell, which is a naturally made barrier to keep toxins and other poisons out. So in the US, we put our eggs in the fridge to keep the growth of bacteria, if there is any still on the outside of the shell, to keep that bacterial growth arrested. So because once it does start to grow, it can easily cross through the shell, through the weakened barrier because of the chemically soaked shell. In other countries, they don't raise their chickens like this, so their eggs aren't covered in really dangerous bacteria and feces, and so there is no regulation in other areas to bathe the eggs in chemicals to kill the bacteria, which in effect weakens the shell. That actually lets the bacteria in, which is why we keep them in the fridge. Industrial food production in the US, they don't do it this way everywhere. One other example, my dad is always talking about how he eats antibiotic-free chicken from Tyson, I'm pretty sure. So I looked into that one day. The reason why Tyson chicken is antibiotic free is because instead of giving the chickens antibiotics to kill the bacteria, they simply spray the meat with chlorine in order to kill the bacteria. So antibiotic-free chicken. And the best part is the chlorine doesn't even kill the bacteria. It just lowers the levels down low enough to be below FDA requirements. There was a big story that came out a year or so ago, an article about Brexit, before Brexit had sort of gone through, or if they knew it was going to or not. People in Britain were concerned that if Brexit went through and Britain was no longer part of the European Union, which has really strict food regulations, that Britain would get more imports from the US for food. And one of the things they were worried about being imported from the US was the US's chlorinated chicken, right? i.e. sort of antibiotic-free chicken. So anyways, just a side note, this is how we make our food here. And one other note, antibiotic-free, right? It sounds good. It catches our eye. My dad thinks he's doing a good thing when he buys that chicken for his health. Be careful of these health claims, right? They might not mean much at all. And so just to give you an idea of how things have changed in the past century, how things came to be the way they are today. In the 1920s, back when George Naylor's grandfather was on the farm, about a quarter of Americans worked in agriculture. The average farm produced 20 bushels per acre. This is about the same yield that Native Americans got on that land prior. U.S. farms were diverse. They had different crops and animals: cattle, chicken, corn, wheat, hay, oats, potatoes. You could feed the people living on the farm as well as the animals on the farm, and additionally sell products coming off the farm. Farms at this time were more resilient as well. They were diversified. If one crop collapsed because of climatic fluctuations, that's okay. They could rely on others they were growing. If the price went down on the market, that's okay. The farmer had other crops to sell on the market to rely on. And at this time, we spent about 22% of our income on food. That's in 1949. So this is the myth that the industry is interested in perpetuating. You see this on packaging in the stores all the time. Farmer John, farmer this, the family farm, producing fresh, healthy food for you. And this is the reality. It's not a small family farm producing fresh food. It's a factory, right? A monocropping paradigm that has massive outputs of a few commodity crops. The U.S. food system today, compared to the 20s, only about 1.5% of the population works in agriculture. Since the 1960s, the number of farms has declined from 3.2 million to 1.9 million. Remember, it was over 6 million in the 1920s. But at the same time, the average size has increased by 40%, and productivity, how much food's coming off the land, by 82%. So what you're seeing is there's less and less farms, but they're bigger and they're producing a lot more per acre. Most of them just raise single commodities, namely corn and soybeans. And so what we think of normal farming today as in the industrial age is based off monocropping, growing one crop that is produced for sale in the market. And how did this come about? Why this change? It's a result of two key changes. One, fertilizer, and two, the invention of hybrid seeds and later GMOs, genetically modified organisms. The result is an enormous boost in yield, but not without consequences. So first, in terms of fertilizer. So one of the great innovations that allowed for industrial farming to come about happened at the end of World War II in 1947, when a munitions plant, basically a wartime machine made for making ammunition, switched over to making chemical fertilizer. And so during the war effort, large amounts of ammonium were being made as a precursor to munitions. And nitrogen is a limiting factor in the production of ammonium. During World War I, the Allies had had access to large amounts of nitrate deposits in Chile. So they had all their raw materials. The British pretty much owned them at the time. Germany, however, lacked access to natural deposits for nitrogen or nitrate. And so Haber, a German Jew, came up with the Haber-Bosch process. Basically, Haber created it, and some other guy named Bosch came along and popularized it and attached his name to it. And essentially what this allowed Haber to do was turn thin air into fertilizer. So nitrogen is a critical limiting agent in plant growth. So is oxygen and carbon, but plants can easily absorb these from the soil and the air. Air is 78% nitrogen, but atmospheric nitrogen is nutritionally unavailable because nitrogen molecules are held together by strong triple bonds. And so nitrogen has to be fixed, that's the term for it, fixed into some bioavailable form through natural or man-made processes. Previously, prior to the Haber-Bosch process, there were only natural processes for fixing nitrogen into the soil, which is what creates and adds to the fertility of it so you can grow plants. So these two processes, one is there's a bacteria that grows naturally on the roots of legume, bean plants. And as part of the life cycle of this bacteria, it trades the plant for a little drop of sugar that it ingests, and the byproduct from the bacteria is a little molecule of nitrogen that gets fixed back into the soil. And so normally in diversified ecosystems, soil fertility is maintained. There's a sort of natural balance maintained. There's multiple different plants and animals decomposing, adding nutrients to the soil. When we farm, when we monocrop, and we continually plant the same acreage to the same exact species like corn or soy again and again and again, it continually depletes the soil, pulls all the nitrogen and other resources out of it without really putting any back in. The fields are never left fallow. And so the Haber-Bosch process essentially freed us from the constraints of natural soil fertility by figuring out how to synthesize nitrogen out of thin air, allowing it to be fixed into a bioavailable form for plants to take up. The other way that nitrogen can be fixed naturally is lightning. So not a main source of nitrogen fixation. Lightning bolts can break apart the strong triple bonds that hold nitrogen together in the air and rain down a little light patterning of fertility, if you will. And so fixing of nitrogen via the Haber-Bosch process allowed farming to now be based off fossil fuel rather than the sun, right? Again, we are freed from the constraints of naturally produced fertility. We have fossil fuels, this vast reserve, this vast energy source we can draw upon. It's probably the most important invention of the 20th century. It sustains about 40% of the global population. More than half of the fertilizer applied in the United States and around the world is nitrogen. And about 1% of the world's energy supply, like fossil fuels that we burn fossil fuels, 1% of that energy supply is used just via the Haber-Bosch process to fix nitrogen into fertilizer. The invention of fertilizer in combination with the invention of hybrid seeds is what allowed for the current farming situation, this huge boost in yield. So hybrids are crops that are selected for certain traits and then pollinated in the lab. It's somewhat similar to artificial selection, it is artificial selection. So in natural selection, there's genetic variation within a species, within a population. And certain individuals within that population may have certain traits, sharper teeth, they can run faster, they're camouflaged, whatever it is, certain traits that give them a survival and reproductive advantage in their environment. These traits will allow these individuals to survive and reproduce in higher numbers, thus passing those genes on to future generations. Eventually, the population can come to take on different characteristics, and over really long periods of time, possibly speciate into new species. And so artificial selection is similar to natural selection, except instead of nature or the environment filtering out and selecting for the traits, humans do it. And so they select for the traits they want and then breed these plants until those traits become more prevalent. Most of the scientific research around the creation of hybrid seeds for farming occurred at public universities. It was considered a public good, public knowledge. It wasn't something that was patented or sold. And the key trait that was selected for was yield, higher yield specifically. High-yield hybrid seed came on the market in the 1930s, and what you can do with it is, let's take corn, you can plant it close together. It was bred for two things, thicker stalks and also stronger root systems. If you plant non-hybrid varieties close together, they'll stretch out for sunlight as they grow and compete with one another for resources and eventually topple over one another, knock each other down. With hybrid corn, every single plant is a clone. It's an exact genetic clone. So no one plant has an advantage, grows higher than the other. Again, bred for stronger root systems and thicker stalks, you can plant them super close together and they'll all grow straight up. So that where you could plant maybe 8,000 plants on an acre in the 1920s, you can plant 30,000 plants on an acre now. Poland calls it a true socialist utopia. And it's this combination of fertilizer with hybrid seeds that's known as the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution as a term is sort of an oxymoron. It refers to this explosion in our ability to produce food, large yields. The consequences, though, are not so green. So this shows total world production of coarse grain from 1961 to 2004, the Source Food Agricultural Organization. And if you look at the blue and the red lines, the top lines, it shows that we are producing way more food. Yield is up, production is up. The bottom two lines, area harvested and seed, hasn't really increased, maybe even declined a little bit. So we're growing way more food on the exact same amount or even less land. This has certain advantages. We can feed a lot more people. We can produce a lot more cheap commodity crops. The question of who benefits from that we'll get to at the end of this talk. Big gains, but also big problems. First of all, environmental issues. Industrial agriculture is really polluting and wasteful. Enormous amounts of chemical and fossil fuel inputs from industrial farming contribute to environmental degradation. One great example of that is runoff from fertilizer in the fields. This increases nitrogen in our freshwater and our groundwater tables. And so Poland talks about this example of something called blue baby alerts in Des Moines, Iowa. During the spring, when the runoff from agricultural fields is highest, the city of Des Moines actually issues something called blue baby alerts, warning parents not to give their children water from the tap because it's been contaminated with fertilizer runoff. And there's so much nitrogen in the water that the nitrates actually bind to the hemoglobin in the body and compromises the body's ability to carry oxygen around the brain. And younger children and babies can't handle it. They'll literally turn blue and suffocate. So we have a city in our country that has an official policy called a blue baby alert to warn not to give your babies tap water during a certain time of the season because of the way that we farm and the chemicals that we dump onto our environments. Another consequence of nitrogen runoff, fertilizer runoff, is hypoxic or dead zones in water. The Gulf of Mexico, for example, pictured on the slide, shows a dead zone the size of New Jersey. So what happens is, in these hypoxic zones, fertilizer nitrogen runoff accumulates in the fresh water and runs downstream, eventually entering out into the Gulf, the ocean. Nitrogen, as well as other minerals and nutrients, are again critical limiting agents in plant growth, including the growth of algae. And so what happens is the freshwater and the Gulf becomes eutrophied. There's a rush of plant nutrients in the form of nitrogen, and it causes a complete bloom and explosion in the algae population. The effect of this is it chokes out all the oxygen in the marine environment and kills literally everything else in that ecosystem. So it's good for the algae, maybe from that standpoint, but not for most anything else in the ecosystem. Another thing about industrial agriculture is it's extremely wasteful in terms of resource use and pollution. More than 1 calorie of fossil fuels, and we're talking about kilocalories, synonymous with food calories here, just a measure of energy use. 1 calorie of fossil fuels is used to produce, more than 1 calorie is needed to produce just 1 calorie of food. This is because not necessarily human energy inputs, but all the non-human energy inputs, the fossil fuels, the fertilizer that goes into the farming. Before we started using synthetic fertilizers, for every energy invested in food production, you got at least 2 calories back, right? In the tribal world, small scale societies, for every calorie invested in producing food, you got about 10 calories back. So our system's extremely inefficient relative to other societies throughout time and space. Poland also talks about something called the wet mill. This is where corn basically goes to die and live on in all the products that we put it in. It's where corn goes to get processed. Each calorie produced in processing uses at least 10 calories of fossil fuels burned. On top of that, for 1 bushel of corn, it takes about half a gallon of oil and 5 gallons of water, just in growing and milling it, respectively. That's not to mention transporting and cooking and all the other things we do with it. The rise of industrial agriculture also had social consequences, one of which is it has destroyed the small farm. So as corn production increased, and we're talking sort of post-World War II, the price of corn declined. The only way for farmers to maintain their livelihoods when this happens is to produce more corn. So the way this works is if you flood the market with any sort of commodity or item, you create more supply, but there's not an increased demand. The result is the price falls, right? You have to offer your surplus of corn or whatever it is you're selling for less in order to stay competitive on the market, because so many people grew corn that year. So many people are trying to sell it. There's not enough demand. It drives the price down as people compete to try to get you to buy their corn at a lower price. So to stay whole, you're selling corn at a lower price, you have to sell more of it. This drives production up. We also needed less people to grow just corn and soybeans. Small farms essentially disappeared. You don't need warm bodies. You don't need humans to do it. Farming communities have become depopulated. Michael Pollan gives examples in the small towns he visits in Iowa. One example where it takes 4 high schools to create just 1 football team. The closest store with edible food is a 30-minute drive from some of these farms. And the food that's being grown on the farms now, you can't eat most of it. It's this hybrid corn that will break your teeth if you bite into it off the stalk. It has to be processed into animal feed or processed food before we can actually ingest it. Remember, growing corn is just riding tractors and spraying. And so there's no jobs, there's no employment out here anymore. Another effect is that all this cheap corn has made it profitable to fatten cows and chicken, livestock, with corn instead of grass or other feed that they naturally would eat. So farmers that are still raising cows and chicken on their natural feed could no longer sell their livestock. They couldn't compete with the cheap cows and chickens being sold on the cheap corn-fed diets. Grass-fed cows can't really compete with these large CAFOs, these concentrated feeding operations that we have. Industrial agriculture has also not helped the farmer in general.